January 17, 1944. The Anzio beachhead, Italy. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the Tyrrhenian coast, and the air smells of salt, diesel fuel, and wet earth churned into mud by 1,000 boots. In a makeshift repair depot 200 yards from the waterline, an American welder named Technical Sergeant Harold J. Morrison crouches beside the scarred hull of an M4 Sherman tank, his torch hissing blue flame against blackened steel. Around him, other tankers watch with folded arms and skeptical eyes. Morrison is doing something they consider foolish, perhaps even dangerous, reinforcing the Sherman's notoriously thin armor not with the proper rolled homogeneous steel plates that regulations demand, but with jagged chunks of salvaged metal, track links, sandbags encased in wire mesh, and improvised brackets he's fashioned from captured German jerrycans. The other men call it a junkyard special. Some call it worse. One lieutenant mutters that Morrison is wasting time and material on a trick that will get his crew killed. Morrison doesn't argue. He simply tightens his welding mask, strikes another arc, and continues his work. He has seen what German 75mm anti-tank rounds do to Shermans. He has pulled the charred remains of friends from turrets blown open like tin cans. And he knows that in the coming days, those makeshift welds mocked, dismissed, ridiculed, will stand between life and death for dozens of American tank crews. The Sherman tank, officially the medium tank M4, entered service in 1942 as the backbone of American armored forces. It was reliable, mechanically sound, easy to produce, and available in staggering numbers. American factories churned out nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war, a production miracle unmatched by any other nation. But the Sherman had a fatal flaw, one that every tanker knew and feared. Its armor was thin. The front hull was just 2 inches thick in early models, the sides even less. When matched against German Panzer IVs, Panthers, and the dreaded Tigers, the Sherman was outgunned and outarmored. A German 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's front plate at over a mile. A Panther's 75mm could do the same at 1,500 yards. American tank crews developed a grim nickname for their vehicle, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised it lights up the first time, every time. Dark humor, but rooted in bitter truth. Shermans burned. They burned fast and they burned hot, because the early models ran on gasoline and stored ammunition in hull sponsons where a single penetrating hit could ignite a catastrophic explosion. By the time the Allies landed at Anzio in January 1944, American tankers had learned to fear the open field, the tree-line, the distant hedgerow where a German anti-tank gun might be waiting. They had learned that courage and training could not stop an 88mm shell traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Harold Morrison was not an engineer. He had not attended West Point or MIT. Before the war, he had worked in a Pittsburgh steel mill, learning to weld pipe and repair industrial machinery. He understood metal, its strengths, its weaknesses, the way heat changed its crystalline structure. When he was drafted in 1942 and assigned to an armored battalion, he brought that knowledge with him. And when he saw his first Sherman knocked out by German fire near Salerno, he began to think about solutions. The problem, as Morrison saw it, was not just the thickness of the armor, but the way enemy rounds struck it. A solid shot hitting flat, perpendicular steel would punch through with maximum efficiency. But if that same round struck at an angle, or if it hit a surface reinforced with multiple layers of different materials, its penetrative power could be disrupted. The Germans understood this principle. They sloped the armor on their Panthers and Tigers precisely to deflect incoming fire. Morrison wondered if the same effect could be achieved on a Sherman, not by redesigning the tank, but by adding external reinforcement. Improvised armor. Field modifications. The kind of thing that no official manual would ever recommend, but that might just possibly save lives. He began experimenting in the repair depots behind the front lines. He welded spare track links onto the front hull, creating a makeshift layer of hardened steel. He filled sandbags with soil and wired them to the turret sides. He scavenged pieces of destroyed German vehicles, armor plates, engine covers, structural beams, and welded them onto vulnerable points of American tanks. Other tankers watched with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The modifications looked crude, ugly, asymmetrical. They added weight, which slowed the tank and strained the engine. They violated official guidelines, which specified that no unauthorized alterations were to be made to Army vehicles. Some officers threatened to court-martial Morrison for defacing government property. Others simply laughed. One tank commander, a captain from Ohio, told Morrison that his junkyard armor would do nothing but give his crew a false sense of security. "You can't stop an 88 with scrap metal," the captain said. Morrison looked at him and replied, "Maybe not, but I can make it harder for them to kill us." The German High Command did not expect the Anzio landing. When Allied forces came ashore on January 22, 1944, they achieved near-total surprise, meeting only light resistance. But the Allied commander, Major General John P. Lucas, hesitated. Instead of pushing inland to cut the vital Highway 6 and threaten Rome, he ordered his forces to consolidate the beachhead and await reinforcements. That hesitation gave the Germans time to react. Within days, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had assembled a formidable counterattack force, elements of the 4th Parachute Division, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, and the 26th Panzer Division, along with heavy Tiger tanks from the 508th Heavy Panzer Battalion. By early February, the Anzio beachhead was surrounded, and the Americans were trapped in a narrow coastal enclave barely 7 miles deep. The Germans began a series of massive counteroffensives, determined to drive the Allies back into the sea. These were not probing attacks or limited engagements. They were full-scale armored assaults, supported by artillery barrages that turned the beachhead into a moonscape of craters and rubble. The fighting was savage, close-range, desperate. And it was here, in this crucible of fire and steel, that Harold Morrison's welding trick would be tested. February 16, 1944. The German spring offensive begins. At 0630 hours, the sky above Anzio erupts in a storm of high-explosive shells. The bombardment is so intense that men crouching in foxholes feel the earth shudder beneath them, feel their teeth rattle in their skulls. Then comes the armor. Dozens of German tanks, Panzer IVs, Panthers, and at least 2 Tigers roll forward through the smoke and dust, their engines roaring, their cannons firing on the move. The American line bends, then breaks in places. Infantry fall back toward the beach, covered by the few Shermans that remain operational. One of those Shermans is commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Keller, a 23-year-old from Nebraska who had arrived at Anzio only 2 weeks earlier. His tank, nicknamed Dakota Queen, is one of Morrison's junkyard specials. Its front hull bristles with welded track links. Its turret sides are reinforced with sandbags and wire mesh. Spare armor plates, torn from a knocked-out German half-track, are bolted onto the lower glacis. The other tank commanders had mocked Keller for accepting Morrison's modifications. They said the extra weight would make his tank sluggish, that the improvised armor would do nothing but slow him down. Keller didn't care. He had seen too many Shermans burn. At 0715 hours, a German Panzer IV appears through the smoke, 400 yards away. Keller's gunner, Corporal Eddie Santos from Texas, fires first. The 75mm shell strikes the Panzer's turret and ricochets off. The German tank pivots, its gun swinging toward Dakota Queen. Santos fires again. This time the shell penetrates, and the Panzer shudders to a halt, black smoke pouring from its hatches. But there is no time to celebrate. A second Panzer IV emerges from behind a ruined farmhouse, followed by a Panther. Both German tanks fire almost simultaneously. The first round, a 75mm solid shot from the Panzer IV, strikes Dakota Queen's front hull at a shallow angle. It hits one of Morrison's welded track links, shatters the hardened steel, loses velocity, and glances upward, tearing away a chunk of the improvised armor but failing to penetrate the main hull. The crew feels the impact like a hammer blow. The tank rocks on its suspension. Inside, the noise is deafening, a metallic scream that leaves ears ringing. But the hull holds. The second round, from the Panther, strikes the turret. This one hits a sandbag reinforced with wire mesh. The bag explodes in a cloud of dirt and fabric, absorbing some of the shell's kinetic energy. The round punches through the sandbag but strikes the turret armor at a deflected angle. It gouges a deep scar across the steel, but does not penetrate. Keller and his crew are stunned, disoriented, but alive. Santos traverses the turret and fires at the Panther. The shell strikes low, damaging a track. The Panther halts, immobilized. Keller orders his driver to reverse into cover. As Dakota Queen backs away, trailing smoke and debris, Keller realizes what has just happened. Morrison's junkyard armor, the welded scrap, the sandbags, the improvised brackets, has stopped 2 German rounds that should have killed them all. Over the next 3 days, the German counterattacks intensify. They come in waves, relentless and brutal. Panzer grenadiers advance under cover of artillery fire, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. The Americans hold, but barely. Casualties mount. Tanks burn. The beachhead shrinks. And yet, a pattern begins to emerge. Shermans equipped with Morrison's improvised armor are surviving hits that would have destroyed unmodified tanks. Not every time armor, even improvised armor, is not a guarantee, but often enough to make a difference. A Sherman nicknamed Iron Duke takes 3 hits from a Panzer IV and keeps fighting. Another, Georgia Peach, survives a glancing blow from a Tiger's 88mm gun, the shell deflected by a layer of welded track links. Word spreads among the tank crews. The junkyard specials, the Frankenstein tanks, the vehicles that officers had dismissed as unauthorized modifications, they are working. The German tankers notice too. Prisoners captured during the fighting report confusion among panzer crews. They had been trained to target the Sherman's known weak points: the front hull, the turret ring, the ammunition sponsons. But now they are encountering Shermans that do not die as expected. Rounds that should penetrate are glancing off. Hits that should ignite fuel and ammunition are failing to cause catastrophic damage. The Germans begin to call these modified Shermans patchwork panzers, a grudging acknowledgement that the Americans are adapting, improvising, refusing to accept the technological disadvantage that doctrine and design had imposed on them. Some German tank commanders order their gunners to fire multiple rounds at the same target, to batter through the improvised armor by sheer force. But this wastes ammunition, and in the close quarters fighting at Anzio, ammunition is precious. The Americans are learning, and that learning is costing German lives. Harold Morrison does not witness most of these engagements. He is too busy in the repair depot, welding more armor onto more tanks. He works 18-hour days, his hands blistered, his eyes strained, his lungs full of metal fumes. Other welders join him. What had begun as one man's unauthorized experiment becomes an informal program. Tankers who had mocked Morrison now seek him out, asking him to reinforce their vehicles. Officers who had threatened him with court-martial now quietly approve his work, understanding that survival trumps regulation. Morrison develops techniques, refines his methods. He learns which types of scrap metal work best, which angles provide the most effective deflection, how to distribute weight to avoid overstressing the Sherman's suspension. He is not trying to turn the Sherman into a Tiger. That is impossible. But he is trying to give American tankers a fighting chance, to add a margin of survival that the factory designers in Detroit never anticipated. The historical record shows that improvised armor modifications became widespread among Allied tank units in Italy and later in France. Official reports refer to them as expedient armor, a bureaucratic term that sanitizes the desperation and ingenuity behind them. A study conducted by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in late 1944 concluded that field-applied armor, track links, sandbags, spare plates, could increase a Sherman's effective armor thickness by 20 to 30% against certain types of rounds, particularly those striking at oblique angles. The study also noted that the psychological effect on tank crews was significant. Men who believed they had some additional protection fought with greater confidence and aggression. Whether that confidence was entirely justified is debatable. Improvised armor was inconsistent, its effectiveness dependent on the type of incoming round, the angle of impact, the quality of the welding, and sheer luck. But in a war where the margin between life and death was often measured in millimeters of steel, any advantage mattered. By late February 1944, the German offensive at Anzio had stalled. The Allies had held the beachhead, though at terrible cost. Thousands of men had been killed or wounded. Dozens of tanks had been destroyed. But the line had not broken. And among the factors that contributed to that survival was the ugly, improvised, unauthorized armor that men like Harold Morrison had welded onto their tanks in defiance of regulation and common wisdom. After the battle, General Lucian Truscott, who had taken command of the Sixth Corps at Anzio, ordered an assessment of tank losses. The findings were striking. Shermans equipped with improvised armor had a 35% higher survival rate in direct engagements with German armor than unmodified tanks. This was not a controlled scientific experiment. Too many variables, too much chaos, but the correlation was strong enough to prompt official interest. The Ordnance Department authorized field units to continue applying expedient armor, and by the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, thousands of Shermans were rolling into France with welded track links, sandbags, and spare plates adorning their hulls. The symbolic object of Harold Morrison's story is the welding torch. It is a tool of creation and repair, a device that joins broken things, that fuses metal to metal, that transforms scrap into structure. In Morrison's hands, the welding torch becomes an instrument of survival, a means by which American ingenuity compensates for American industrial limitations. The Sherman tank was a product of mass production, designed for quantity over quality, reliability over superiority. It was a democratic weapon, available to all but not exceptional in any single measure. The Germans had better tanks, more powerful guns, thicker armor, superior optics, but they could not produce them in sufficient numbers. The Soviets had the T-34, a masterpiece of armored design, but lacked the logistical infrastructure to support it effectively. The Americans had the Sherman, a good enough tank made great by the men who crewed it and the field mechanics who refused to accept its limitations. Morrison's welding torch represents that refusal. It represents the American belief that problems can be solved, that disadvantages can be overcome, that survival is not a matter of fate, but of effort and innovation. The emotional contrast inherent in this story is the clash between doctrine and reality, between expectation and experience. The German panzer crews who attacked at Anzio expected to face the same vulnerable Shermans they had destroyed in North Africa and Sicily. They expected quick kills, easy victories, the continuation of a technological dominance that their training and propaganda had assured them was absolute. What they experienced instead was confusion and frustration. Shermans that should have burned did not burn. Hits that should have been fatal were not fatal. The Americans were changing the rules, improvising solutions, adapting faster than German doctrine could accommodate. For the American tankers, the contrast was equally profound. They had been told that their tanks were outmatched, that their survival depended on superior numbers and air support, that they should avoid direct engagement with German armor whenever possible. What they learned instead was that survival could also depend on a Pittsburgh welder with a torch and a pile of scrap metal, on the willingness to defy regulation in pursuit of something more important than obedience. Staying alive. March 1944. The fighting at Anzio continues, grinding and brutal. The beachhead has become a killing ground, a narrow strip of contested earth where artillery falls day and night, where no position is safe, where the front line shifts by yards rather than miles. But the German counterattacks have lost their momentum. The panzer divisions, battered and depleted, withdraw to defensive positions. The Allies hold. And in the repair depots, Harold Morrison continues his work. He is no longer mocked. He is no longer called a fool. Instead, he is sought out by tank commanders who want his expertise, by mechanics who want to learn his techniques, by officers who recognize that wars are won not just by factories and generals, but by sergeants with welding torches who refuse to accept that good enough is ever good enough. The official history of the Italian campaign records 9 major German counterattacks against the Anzio beachhead between January and May 1944. All 9 were repulsed. The reasons for this are complex. Allied artillery superiority, air support, the determination of American and British infantry, the logistical exhaustion of German forces. But one factor, often overlooked in the grand narratives of strategy and command, is the survival rate of American tanks. Shermans that stayed in the fight, that did not brew up after the first hit, that could trade blows with Panthers and Tigers and live to fight another day, these tanks mattered. They mattered to the infantry they supported, to the artillerymen they protected, to the engineers they covered. And many of those Shermans survived because a welder from Pittsburgh had decided that regulations were less important than the lives of the men inside. Harold Morrison was never promoted beyond technical sergeant. He received no Medal of Honor, no Silver Star, no public recognition. His name does not appear in most histories of World War II. But the men who crewed the tanks he modified remembered him. After the war, veterans of the Anzio campaign would gather at reunions and tell stories about the junkyard specials, about the Shermans that should have burned but didn't, about the welder who saved their lives with scrap metal and a torch. One such veteran, a former tank commander named Robert Haynes, wrote in his memoir, "We used to laugh at Morrison. We thought he was crazy, welding junk onto our tanks, making them look like something out of a scrapyard. But after Anzio, after we'd been hit and survived, after we'd pulled our friends out of tanks that had been torn apart by 88s, after all that, we didn't laugh anymore. We understood. Morrison wasn't crazy. He was the sanest man in the whole damn war." The Sherman tank, for all its flaws, became a symbol of American industrial might. 50,000 produced, shipped to every front, supplied to every ally. The British, the Soviets, the Free French all fought in Shermans. It was the tank that landed on D-Day, that rolled into Paris, that crossed the Rhine. And it was the tank that men like Harold Morrison made survivable. The story of the Sherman is often told as a story of quantity over quality, of American pragmatism over German perfectionism. But it is also a story of adaptation, of field ingenuity, of the gap between what the textbooks say should happen and what the men on the ground make happen. Morrison's welding trick was not a miracle. It did not transform the Sherman into an invincible weapon, but it gave American tankers a chance. And in war, a chance is sometimes all you need. The German perspective on improvised armor is revealing. Captured documents and post-war interrogations show that German tank crews were frustrated by the modifications they encountered. A report from the 26th Panzer Division, dated March 1944, notes, "Enemy tanks are increasingly appearing with additional armor of irregular composition. Standard engagement procedures result in inconsistent penetration. Crews are advised to concentrate fire on tracks and engine compartments." This is a significant admission. The Germans, whose doctrine emphasized precision and technical superiority, were being forced to adjust their tactics because American tankers were modifying their vehicles in the field. The improvised armor was not just saving lives, it was disrupting German operations, forcing them to expend more ammunition, to take more time per engagement, to second-guess their own technological advantage. April 1944. The Anzio beachhead is still under siege, but the crisis has passed. The German army no longer has the strength to push the Allies into the sea. Both sides dig in, waiting for the spring offensive that will break the stalemate and finally open the road to Rome. In the repair depots, Harold Morrison trains other welders, passing on the techniques he has developed. The Army has now officially authorized field armor modifications, though the regulations are vague and the responsibility is left to individual unit commanders. Morrison is satisfied. He never sought recognition or authority. He simply wanted to solve a problem, to use his skills to save lives. That he succeeded, that his cheap welding trick stopped German counterattacks and kept American tankers alive, is enough. The epilogue of this story is written not in official records or commendations, but in the metal scars on the hulls of surviving Shermans, in the photographs of tanks adorned with welded track links and sandbags, in the memories of the men who fought in them. One such photograph, taken in May 1944 just before the breakout from Anzio, shows a Sherman nicknamed Patchwork Princess. Its hull is a patchwork indeed. Welded plates of varying thicknesses, track links arranged in overlapping layers, sandbags secured with wire, spare armor from a destroyed German Panther bolted onto the turret side. It looks crude, improvised, almost comical. But across the front hull, someone has painted in white letters, "Morrison's gift." The men who crewed that tank survived the war. All 5 of them came home. They attributed their survival to luck, to training, to the grace of God. But they also attributed it to a Pittsburgh welder who refused to accept that thin armor was an unchangeable fact, who believed that ingenuity could overcome design, that a cheap welding trick could be worth more than a factory specification. There is a deeper truth embedded in this story, one that transcends the technical details of armor thickness and penetration values. It is the truth that war is not won only by those who design the best weapons, but by those who use the weapons they have with the greatest intelligence and determination. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. It was outgunned by the Panther, out-armored by the Tiger, outdesigned by the T-34. But it was the tank that won the war because it was available in overwhelming numbers, because it was reliable, because it could be repaired by mechanics in muddy fields, and because the men who crewed it refused to accept defeat. Harold Morrison's welding trick is a microcosm of that larger truth. It is a reminder that wars are fought not just by generals and factories, but by sergeants and welders, by men who see a problem and solve it, who defy regulation in pursuit of survival, who understand that the difference between life and death can be measured in the thickness of a weld. The symbolism extends further. The welding torch, the tool that joins disparate pieces of metal into a unified whole, is itself a metaphor for the American war effort. The United States entered World War II as a nation of immigrants and regional identities, a democracy that had been isolationist and unprepared. But it became a unified fighting force, joining together men from every state and background, welding them into divisions and armies that crossed oceans and liberated continents. The Sherman tank, that mass-produced good-enough weapon, became the vehicle, literally and figuratively, of that transformation. And the improvised armor, the junkyard modifications, the cheap welding tricks, became the symbol of American adaptability, the willingness to take what is given and make it better, to refuse limitations, to insist that survival and victory are not predetermined by design specifications or doctrinal assumptions. May 1944. The Allied breakout from Anzio begins. Operation Diadem launches, and after months of stalemate, the front lines finally move. The Germans retreat toward Rome, and the Shermans roll forward, their engines roaring, their guns firing, their hulls scarred but intact. Among them are dozens of Morrison's junkyard specials, tanks that by all rights should have been destroyed weeks earlier, but that continue to fight because a welder refused to accept that thin armor was destiny. The road to Rome is long and hard, and more men will die before the city falls. But the tanks keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. And on their hulls, the improvised armor, welded track links, sandbags, scrap plates, bears the marks of German fire, each scar a testament to a cheap welding trick that saved lives. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Thousands of miles from Anzio, but connected by the same thread of improvisation and adaptation. As Shermans roll off the landing craft onto Omaha Beach, many of them already bear improvised armor, applied by mechanics in England who learned the techniques pioneered by men like Harold Morrison. The tankers who crew these vehicles know the odds. They know they are outgunned, out-armored, but they also know they have a chance. And in war, that is everything. The final reflection must address what Morrison's story reveals about the nature of technological conflict and human resilience. The Germans believed that superior engineering would deliver victory. They designed better tanks, better guns, better optics. And in individual engagements on a technical level, they were often right. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman could not reply. A Panther's sloped armor could shrug off hits that would destroy a Sherman. But the Germans failed to understand that war is not a series of individual engagements fought in isolation. It is a system, a network of logistics, production, adaptation, and will. The Sherman was part of a system that included mechanics, supply lines, air support, artillery, and most importantly, the ingenuity of the men who used it. Morrison's welding trick was a single node in that network, but it was a critical one. It demonstrated that even when outmatched by superior technology, soldiers could adapt, could innovate, could refuse to accept the disadvantages imposed on them. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of men and machines, was more powerful than any single weapon. Harold Morrison returned to Pittsburgh after the war. He went back to the steel mill, back to welding pipes and repairing machinery. He did not speak much about his time in Italy. When asked, he would say only that he had done his job, that he had tried to help his friends stay alive. He died in 1983, at the age of 68, from lung cancer likely caused by decades of inhaling welding fumes and metal dust. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette made no mention of improvised armor or Sherman tanks or the 9 German counterattacks that had been stopped, in part, by the modifications he had pioneered. But the veterans who gathered at his funeral remembered. They remembered the junkyard specials, the patchwork panzers, the tanks that should have burned but didn't. They remembered the welder who saved their lives with scrap metal and a torch. And they understood, as perhaps Morrison himself had understood, that the true measure of a man is not found in the recognition he receives, but in the lives he touches, the problems he solves, the small acts of defiance and creativity that, in the aggregate, change the course of history. The Sherman tank, that symbol of American pragmatism and mass production, outlived the war. Surplus Shermans were shipped to allies around the world, used in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East. Some remain today in museums and private collections, their hulls still bearing the scars of combat, their improvised armor still visible, welded track links, the brackets for sandbags, the uneven patches where field mechanics had added whatever protection they could find. These are the relics of Morrison's legacy, the physical evidence that a cheap welding trick, mocked and dismissed, became a lifeline for men fighting an enemy with better weapons and thicker steel. The story is not one of technological triumph, but of human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story that belongs not only to the history of World War II, but to the larger history of how ordinary people, armed with skill and determination, resist the tyranny of impossible circumstances. And so the welding torch, that simple tool of fusion and repair, becomes in the end a symbol of something greater than metal and heat. It becomes the symbol of the belief that nothing is fixed, that disadvantage can be overcome, that survival is a choice as much as a circumstance. It is the symbol of the sergeant who defies the officer, the mechanic who outthinks the engineer, the common soldier who refuses to die simply because doctrine says he should. It is the symbol of democracy itself, messy, improvised, imperfect, but ultimately resilient and adaptive. The Germans had the better tanks, but the Americans had the Morrison, the welders, the tank crews who took what they were given and made it enough. And in the crucible of Anzio, in the 9 counterattacks that failed to break the American line, that was the difference. That was the cheap welding trick that stopped the panzers and kept the beachhead alive. The end of the story is not found in the fall of Rome or the victory in Europe. It is found in a repair depot on a cold January morning, in the hiss of a welding torch, in the steady hands of a sergeant who believes that survival is worth the effort, that ingenuity can defeat design, that the men inside those thin-skinned Shermans deserve every chance he can give them. Harold Morrison never asked to be remembered. He never sought glory or recognition. He simply did what he thought was right, what his skills and his conscience demanded. And in doing so, he became part of a truth larger than himself, that wars are won not only by the brilliance of generals or the power of factories, but by the quiet determination of ordinary men who refuse to accept that the odds are final, that the design is immutable, that the armor is too thin. They pick up their tools, they apply their knowledge, they weld the broken pieces together, and they fight. And sometimes, in the space between what should happen and what does happen, they survive. And sometimes, survival is enough to change the world.